Yeah, this talk will be on the meaning of Mises, meaning what did he accomplish, what sort of a person was he, and I guess the meaning of his life. First of all, I guess I shouldn't. Usually, when I start off talking about Austrian economics, my first statement I really don't have to make in this company. Namely, I'll make it anyway. Namely, that has nothing to do with Austria. I mean, I'm not an expert on the economics of Austria. I know nothing about their banking system or what's going on there. So it's called the Austrian School because it began in Austria and began at the University of Vienna and emanated from there. So that we're now at the point where, for a long time, there were no Austrians in Austria, so to speak, and there are some, I think, now, more or less, fellow travelers at least. But so schools of thought are labeled by places where they originated and incubated and so forth. The Austrian school was started in the 1870s with Karl Menger, as most people know here. And it was built on a completely different tradition from the dominant British tradition, which most people are familiar with, the Smith-Ricardo classical school tradition. The focus of the British tradition was always on aggregates, groups, and other fallacious insights, and classes. The focus of the continental school of thought, starting with the scholastics and working on the Spanish scholastics and then France and Italy for centuries, was the individual, starting with the individual. And that tradition was more or less swamped in the Smith-Ricardo dominance. It turns out now, by the way, it wasn't really swamped until John Stuart Mill reestablished Ricardo in 1848. And so that, with Mill's tremendous influence in English and British economics, any other schools of thought were sort of swallowed up. The classical school, of course I'm going over this very, very, very quickly. The classical school, for example, claimed that value is determined by cost of production, inherent in the product. And by doing this, of course, they had to leave out explanations of the values of goods which are not reproducible, such as Rembrandt paintings. In other words, Rembrandt embodied a certain number of labor hours. We don't really know how many labor hours embodied in Rembrandt's paintings, and that's it. So the value of a Rembrandt, obviously fluctuating over time, has very little to do with the number of labor hours put in by Rembrandt. So that the explanation of those sort of goods had to be left out. And had to deal with goods that are reproducible. And the emphasis, I'm convinced now, on the quantity of labor hours, labor theory of value, which of course is again a British product, Smith and Ricardo. But the emphasis on that, I think, is pretty well. This is fairly speculative, I think, pretty well established. It really comes in from Scottish Calvinism, in which Adam Smith was imbued, and the Calvinists being uniquely believing that that labor is not only necessary but also a good in itself, and that so the emphasis on labor as a good in itself seeps into the value theory. And of course we know about the value paradox, which Smith and Ricardo couldn't solve, namely how come the diamonds or water on the one hand, or water, for example, is a very useful good and yet is very cheap. Those days was virtually free. And diamonds is a mere frippery. As a matter of fact, with Smith, he almost says the diamonds are useless, a good Calvinist position. And yet, of course, they're very expensive. And so here we have an alleged paradox that the use value of bread or water is much greater than the use value of diamonds, and yet they're much cheaper on the market. Therefore, we can't explain it. Therefore, we have to toss out use value as any kind of explanation of prices. Oddly enough, Smith solved the very same paradox that he couldn't solve in The Wealth of Nations. He solved 20 years earlier in his lectures. And a pretty good explanation, the usual explanation taken from scholastics through the Scottish Enlightenment. And it's still not quite comprehensible why he didn't include this in The Wealth of Nations, why he couldn't solve it by the time of The Wealth of Nations. It couldn't be the lectures were a previous publication. He couldn't say, I refer you back to my previous book, because the lectures weren't published until the 20th century. So, at any rate, in addition, another problem with classical economics was the emphasis on aggregates. Ricardo's major worry, his major problem was how are classes of income, how is income distributed between various classes, between workers, capitalists, and landlords. And so the focus then was who gets what share of the pie, and of course it's very easy from that to arrive at a class struggle view of the economy. Because whatever one group doesn't get, if one group gets more, the other group automatically has to get less. So this I think led fairly quickly to both Marx and Henry George, both wings of Ricardians, and both I think pretty good Ricardians if you start with that kind of assumption. In other words, if you're interested in any sense in justice and you're a Ricardian, you might wind up pretty quickly as either a Georgist or a Marxist or both. And along with that comes the split between production and distribution. If somehow the laws of production are out here, and the laws of distribution are out there, and they're not really in contact. And therefore you can muck around with with distribution and not influence production. And finally, well, there's a couple more problems of a classical school. I don't want to spend too much time on it. One is the emphasis almost completely on long-run equilibrium, which is really a tendency and yet is elevated into an always existing force. In long-run equilibrium is perfect certainty. Since there's never any change, there's obviously going to be certainty. Perfect competition, perfect knowledge of the present and future, no profits and losses, and so forth and so on. So the emphasis gets to be mostly on that, and still is, even today. And finally, the severe split between the macro and the microspheres, which of course we're all too familiar with now. There's the money sphere where things are going on with money and general prices, and there's the microsphere where there's supply and demand, and never the twain meets, the two hermetically sealed divisions of life. And if those of you who have taken a micro course, you learn about supply and demand, all these good things, it makes a fair amount of sense. And then you get to macro, all of a sudden all these things drop out, and you're dealing with statistics. With no connection really between the two of them. I think that starts with Ricardo's legacy. At any rate, the Austrians, starting with 1871, starting with Menger's Principle of Economics, begins the Austrian school, building on the continental tradition, building on the French tradition, some German, and starting with, and as in that tradition, a little bit related to J.B. Say, I'm going to say also in France, basing their analysis on the individual, on methodological individualism, as Mises would call it. Each individual's actions and how you build up the individual actions into a general analysis. And from that, you can see fairly readily the purpose of production is consumption. Consumption is the end result, the end goal of action in the market. And also the value of products, whether they be Rembrandts or steel bars or automobiles or bubble gum, the value of all products are conferred upon the product by consumers, by consumer valuation, by choices of consumers. They're not inherent in the product. There's no thing in there which has 20 utils. Okay, I can work for many years on some product and come up with it. Nobody will buy it, and the number of my hours involved in it doesn't mean a damn thing to the result. So the various individuals, various consumers on the market, with their value scales, with their subjective valuations, they're the only ones that confer value upon any product. And since, this relates to the value paradox, since things are valued on the market in specific units, in other words, we don't value all the bread in the world on the market. We value one loaf of Wonder Bread. How much am I willing to pay for one loaf of Wonder Bread? I'm not talking about how much would I be willing to pay, or all of us be willing to pay for the entire bread in the universe. But it's not a real world option. And so since all action on the market deals with units of labor, units of goods, units of product, this margin, the utility of each margin utility of the product determines the value on the market. Of course, the value paradox is then solved, the diamond bread, diamond water paradox. Namely, if the angel Gabriel came down tomorrow, let's say angel Gabriel interrupted all television sets tomorrow, said, people of earth, listen, that sort of thing, and said, you are now confronted with a choice. Mankind is all confronted with a choice now, from now on. Either all the bread in the world forever and ever. You have to give up one of the two. All bread in the world forever and ever. All diamonds in the world forever and ever. If we're all confronted with that sort of choice, we probably choose bread. However, we're not confronted with that choice. So in the real world, since there's not more loaves of bread around, when there are carats of diamonds, since the supply is so much greater, the value of each unit of bread is much lower. So, as I say, this is really solved by the scholastics in Italy and Spain, and without the marginal emphasis, but almost everything else was contained in their solution. With methodological individualism, you solve the distribution question. Instead of worrying about labor as a whole and profits or capitalists as a whole and landlords as a whole, how much are they getting? You talk about each individual unit. And then the problem is solved, and it turns out that the tendency is for each unit of every factor to get its marginal value product. And so the marginal value productivity theory of the Austrian school then comes in to undercut more or less phony problems, which other schools have been engaged in. So there's no split between production and distribution. What you get on the market, what your wage rate or your price of your capital good or whatever, or your rent of your machine or rent of your land is determined by the marginal value of productivity, how much other people think it's worth on the market, how much its purchasers think it's worth, and that's determined by how much they think they'll get from the product, from the factor. So each factor then tends to get its marginal product. Again, the Bombarwerk, Menger's great pupil, Eugen von Bombarwerk, solved the interest problem, which had not been really solved until then. There were certain hints of a solution before that, but not really copper-riveted until Bombarwerk. The poor scholastics couldn't figure out what justifies a pure riskless loan, more or less riskless loan. And they could understand risk, they understood profit and risk, they understood opportunity cost. They couldn't figure out why people should get an interest on a pure loan. If I loan you $100 for a year, why should I get $10 back in addition to the $100? What's the justification? They couldn't figure it out. Therefore, they said it must be sin. And this attribution of sin to interest poisoned the whole scholastic economics from then on, because then they had to, as realistic people, very, very shrewd capitalists or analysts of the market, they realized if they outlawed interest, the whole economy would go down the drain. They have to find all sorts of ways of getting around opportunity cost, profit foregone, that sort of thing. But they never really solved this riskless interest question. And Bombarwerk comes up with a solution. This is time preference. This is the fact that people prefer, as this really gets back again to individual on the market, individuals in the world. Everybody prefers achieving their wants earlier than later. And since you prefer getting what you want earlier than later, this means that a present good is always worth more than a future good. And this premium is then worked out on the marketplace. And the premium is the rate of interest. That is the basic interest rate. So this was a great solution. It's also solved the Marxian problem. How come capital earns an extra profit, an extra interest rate above the cost of the capital? And that's the answer. And Bombarwerk works this out through the capital structure, also integrates time as a capital theory of capital. We still haven't got back to Bombarwerk yet, by the way. I mean, this might seem like old hat, old conflicts of the 1870s. Modern economic theory still considers capital as a homogeneous lump. And that's it. You add capital in some sort of homogeneous way to other factors. Capital takes time, and therefore it's a structure. It's a lattice work. And this, of course, is, as I say, spelled out by Bombarwerk, and the knowledge has been lost. This, by the way, is an important point, I think, in history of thought in general. History of economic thought, or philosophic thought, or maybe even the hard sciences. Namely, knowledge gets lost. Because we tend to think of the history of science as one great march onward and upward into the light. So that everybody at any given point in time, let's say 1920, knows much more than anybody, knows everything the guy in 1910 did, plus 10 years more of great progress. It really doesn't work that way. And often we lose knowledge. So the fellow in 1920 knows less than the guy in 1910. And similarly, we've lost a lot of knowledge. So that the current textbook does not incorporate all the knowledge of the past, throwing out all the chaff. Sometimes the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. And similarly, one of the things, of course, is capital theory got really thrown out. And most economics still thinks of capital as one big homogeneous lump, and not as a lattice work, as a structure, a time structure. Okay, at any rate, and this, by the way, and also again in Austrian economics, this is, I think, true in general, is that equilibrium is a tendency and not a constant reality. So the market is always moving toward equilibrium, never quite gets there, because the data keeps changing. So even though in the long run profits and losses disappear, Since change is always taking place, the long run never quite gets reached. I like to think of the economy as a dog chasing a mechanical rabbit. And the rabbit always changes direction, and the dog keeps changing direction, trying to follow it, but never eats the rabbit. So equilibrium becomes an important tool of analysis, a tendency, but not an actual living situation. Therefore, you always have entrepreneurial profits and losses, for example. Since once again, modern economics can't really handle the question of entrepreneurship, profits and losses. You can look through textbooks on microeconomics, never see the word profit, very rarely in there, because it all disappears because everything is always automatically in general equilibrium. Everything is in a static state. At any rate, so the Austrian approach, you toss all that out. You start with the real world, and you analyze the individual acting in the real world, and therefore, since the real world is a world of uncertainty, you're constantly in a situation, and action takes place through time, so therefore, you always have profits and losses. You can understand the capitalist entrepreneur's income as a two-part income. One, time preference rate of lending or spending money now and then waiting for the return on time preference or return on waiting, whichever you want to put it. And two, profits and losses for successful entrepreneurship. For being a good entrepreneur, you get profits. For being a lousy entrepreneur, you suffer losses. All right, so then, I would also mention Frank Fetter, one of my favorite economists, who worked out the whole time preference theory and time market theory in great detail from 1900 to 1913 period, building, of course, on von Bauwerk and purifying von Bauwerk's doctrine. All right, this brings us to Mises, my topic today. Can I put some water in here? Okay. All right. Okay. Mises was a brilliant young student in von Bauwerk's famous seminar. Menger had dropped out of teaching by this time. Is there water? Oh, thank you. Okay.
Just required human action.
Okay. I see. I'm a low-tech person. It's too high-tech for me. Thank you. Yeah. Mises was a student of von Bauwerk's famous seminar at the University of Vienna. And the Austrians already arrived at the correct theory of value distribution and so forth and so on, and handling of equilibrium entrepreneurship. They had not yet, however, gotten into macro. They hadn't gotten into the theory of money. They hadn't healed the micro-macro split. And so in his great first work, Mises' great first work in economics, The Theory of Money and Credit, came out in 1912. I'm leaving out his untranslated theory of history of feudalism in Austria. I should say serfdom. His doctoral dissertation on the emancipation of the serfs in Austria, which I have not read, has not been translated. Not read, but I don't think it's really economics, as far as I can understand. Anyway, his first great work was The Theory of Money and Credit, 1912, in which he healed the micro-macro split. He integrated the theory of utility and theory of value, theory of marginal utility into explaining money and prices of money. It was a magnificent achievement. It was not, of course, hailed at the first spot. It became very popular on the continent. He told me that the other people in von Bauwerk's seminar, including von Bauwerk, rejected it as being too radical. Radical in the sense, of course, of being an innovative change. and violating the basic I guess the basic split of micro and macro. They wouldn't put it in those terms then. And so he explained the value of money as a purchasing power of money as just like all other goods determined by supply and demand. It's a great achievement. This had been done by the scholastics again. He's really going back, probably unknowingly, and building it and getting, of course, much more detail. Scholastics were mostly interested in philosophy and not in economics. So, and he showed that just as with any other product, when the supply of something increases, it lowers its value, its marginal utility. So when the supply of money increases, it lowers the value of the money unit in purchasing power terms, and vice versa. An increase in demand for money raises its value. And demand for money is the demand to hold money in cash balances. So right away we anticipate Robertson, I think, much better than Robertson. Robertson, again, being much more aggregative. And Mises always focusing on the individual and building up from there, very much like Cantillon, with much building on Cantillon's analysis in the early 18th century. So And again, using the Ricardian insight, which I think was an important insight, unlike the one difference between goods and money and other goods, the one big difference is it's the same in the sense that the values were determined the same way by supply and demand. The difference is you don't need more money. In other words, if you have a greater supply of goods, it's socially useful, so to speak. Other things being equal, an increase in the supply of consumer goods benefits people. Okay? And an increase in the supply of capital goods benefits people because you increase consumer goods later on. So, with regular goods and services, an increase in supply is beneficial. An increase in supply of money, however, is not socially beneficial. It's pointless because all it does is dilute the value, the effectiveness of each dollar, each money unit. It means it's worth less in purchasing power. So once money gets established on the market as a commodity gets established as money, you don't need any more of it. Any supply is optimal. So this, of course, tosses out all the inflationist arguments we've heard for centuries and for still are hearing. You need more money when population grows. You need more money because the world is more complex. You need more money because there's more oil around. Whatever the arguments are, all this is a lot of nonsense. From these, I see in perspective. So more money inflates and lowers the value of each unit. Okay, that's another thing he points out, Mises does, that money does not act on the famous Friedman helicopter effect manner. There's no split between micro and macro. So that when the supply of money increases, money can never be neutral to the market. Even though it's not socially beneficial, increase in supply, it messes things up. It doesn't just increase the price level, as most economists would now say. Increase in money supply increases the price level. Yes, indeed, but it also does other things. It also messes up the production structure. It messes up the relationship between capital goods and consumer goods. It creates malinvestments, as Mises would put it, thereby setting the stage for inevitable recession. The recession then functions as a way of liquidating, a painful but necessary way of liquidating the unsound investments of the inflationary boom period. So what Mises was getting at, without even realizing in Money and Credit, is getting at a theory of the business cycle, which he then develops in the 1920s. So I'll get to that in a second. Another point that Mises does, he reestablished the so-called currency principle, which at least on the continent had died out, and the fact that the increase in money supply causes deficits in the balance of payments, causes inflation, etc., and brings back the idea of the beneficial aspect of 100% gold banking, 100% reserve banking. Many of this gets picked up later by other economists without referring to Mises or building and sort of botching things up along the way. He also showed something which is very important, which many Austrians still don't understand today, to this day. Again, I'm talking about the loss of knowledge or the whatever, not gaining knowledge in this case. That money comes out of the market. This is the Menger analysis. Money arises as a marketable commodity under barter. And Mises adding the fact that it has to arise out of barter. In other words, a money commodity has to originate as a valuable commodity in non-monetary terms. In other words, it has to be valuable before it gets to be money. Otherwise, nobody would originally buy it. So it has to begin as gold or as cowrie shells or as something. So salt. There's been dozens of monies, and it all originated money cannot originate either as a social contract where everybody gets together. 2,000 people get together. Okay, let's make such and such money. It does not originate that way. It cannot originate by state fiat. It has to originate as a useful, marketable commodity. If you go back and read some of the grand old, wonderful old money and banking textbooks back in the gold standard period, the first chapter always deals with that. Why is such and such chosen as money? They don't talk about Mises' regression theorem, but he shows it has to arise this way. But they say, well, because this commodity, like gold and silver, was rare and valuable and stable and easily recognizable and affordable and carry around when the government's trying to find you. You can sneak out of the country with your pockets full of it, things like that. All the valuable aspects of a money commodity. This is why the market chose it. So we still have people, even Austrians right now, still fooling around with the idea, what money can we create? Without recognizing the fact that money has to begin as a valuable commodity of some sort. It has to begin as a valuable on the market. It can't be newly created. Also, Mises showed, almost in passing, a very important part of theory of money. This is all theory of money and credit. That he showed that marginal utility cannot be measured. He was the first person really to point that out, following Franz Schul, the great Czech economist and von Bauwerk's student. Marginal utility has to be ordinal. It cannot be measurable. You can't use the concept of measurement for internal subjective phenomena, psychic phenomenon. And of course, if utility can't be measured, we then find out later Austrians that cost can't be measured either, since costs are subjective, as all Austrians should say this at any rate. And therefore, you can't use cost-benefit analysis for social projects. You can't say, it's not really legitimate to say the government should build that dam or shouldn't build that dam, because you add up all the costs and add up all the benefits, and you find out the benefits slightly exceed the costs or vice versa. Nobody knows what the benefits are, nobody knows what the costs are, since they're all internally subjective to each person. As I say, the business cycle theory, Mises, really starts in Theory, Money, and Credit. Okay, then he develops that in the 1920s to get to the business cycle theory a little bit further. Really begins with two questions which any business cycle theory should answer. One is, how come there's a cluster of unsound forecasts? Businessmen are good forecasters. I would not go so far as the rational expectations people to say businessmen always forecast everything correctly. They know the future with deep insight, like some kind of clairvoyant. But they're pretty good. I mean, they're in business because they've been good forecasters in the past, and therefore they're generally pretty darn good in the present. How come they've all made this big mistake? In other words, how come at certain crisis periods, 1929 obviously, previous periods, how come they suddenly turn out to be lousy forecasters? They bid up costs way beyond their selling prices they can get for their product. Well, that's an important question. It's usually not even asked by most business cycle theorists. And secondly, well, how come capital goods always fluctuate more than consumer goods? In other words, in every business cycle, capital goods prices rise faster, they boom more than consumer goods, and they collapse much more during the Depression. For example, in the 1929 Depression, capital goods was much greater boom in capital goods than there were in consumer goods. Then comes the big crash. Capital goods prices and employment fell tremendously, and consumer goods prices, just by a slight amount. So those are the two questions which Mises really begins with, and then he formulates his great business cycle theory on the basis of integrating several insights. The currency school insight, for example, as far as I know, he's the only one who's ever said that, Mises, that the famous Ricardian theory of, or Humean Ricardian theory of international monetary relations, monetary payment, is really a business cycle theory in addition to being an international money theory. In other words, what it's saying is the banks increase money supply in one country. Okay. Therefore, prices go up. Therefore, gold flows out, and therefore there's a deficit of balance of payments. Gold flows out, and therefore the banks have to contract, and it causes a recession. This is a simple but important model of a business cycle, a boom-bust situation. So Mises begins with that. He also integrates that with Wicksel's natural interest rate and loan interest rate theory, plus von Bauwerk's theory of capital structure, and winds up with his great business cycle theory, which, to sum it up very quickly, is that the banks increase the supply of money and credit. They do it usually by lending money to businessmen. This causes businessmen it lowers the rate of interest below the free market rate, the rate of which voluntary saving, so to speak, would put effect on the market. In other words, below the time preference rate. And then businessmen are then led to expand investment beyond what they would in capital goods, beyond what they would ordinarily. This creates a malinvestment overinvestment in capital goods, underinvestment in consumer goods. So that's where Harbaugh messed up on. Overinvestment in capital goods, underinvestment in consumer goods. In other words, messing up the production structure. And then when the money supply stops expanding, bingo, this is revealed, and the forecasting turns out to be particularly bad in capital goods industries. In other words, bankruptcies and unemployment in capital goods industries, so that labor, land, and capital can shift back to consumer goods where they originally were in the first place. In other words, the inflationary credit requires a recession once the inflationary credit gets underway. One question about this, which Mises asked in Human Action, he says, well, how come this seems like a very short process? I mean, you expand credit, you cause overinflation of wages in, say, capital goods industries. Workers then spend the money, and then the whole thing, there's too little savings to buy the new investments. Why doesn't the boom last only by a couple of months? Why does it last several years? And the reason is, as Mises points out, is that the banks keep expanding credit to be one step ahead of retribution. In other words, in this case, it's constantly expanding credit so that businesses don't have a liquidity shortage. In other words, so that they can keep refinancing their capital and keep expanding, thereby being one step ahead of recession. As soon as the expansion of credit significantly slows down or stops the whole thing, then recession then comes on like a thunderclap. This question we would ask now, I guess, is with the rational expectations people, how come businessmen don't realize this and stop doing it? In other words, why don't they study Austrian economics, understand that inflationary boom causes overinvestment, therefore not overinvest? And the answer is, doesn't work that simply. And the answer is, it's not irrational to overinvest so long as the boom continues. I know a case, for example, of one of the first Austrian businessmen, converts to Austrian theory, Bill Mullendorf, in the early days of the libertarian movement, free market movement in the 1940s. He was the president of Southern California Edison Company, some Commonwealth Edison, I think it's called. And he takes this to heart. He says, don't expand. He tells businessmen this in 1946. Don't expand because there's going to be a recession. It's inevitable. And the whole thing is a crackpot, and of course they do expand. The thing is he lost money. He lost money for Southern Commonwealth Edison with this kind of policy because even though he's right in the long run, in the meantime it's rational to keep expanding. In other words, what the businessman has to do is to try to figure out how long will this thing continue, this boom. And if the boom will continue for 20 years, you have to keep expanding for 20 years. You can't fight the thing on your own, so to speak. So this is why it's not irrational to overinvest. It's rational to overinvest so long as the government, the banking system keeps creating the boom, the inflationary, boom. And then you try to, the forecasting becomes a question not of GNP models or econometric models, trying to figure out what the jerks in government are going to do. That's the real point. I think that's enough of a business cycle theory. Mises developed and taught his views in his private seminar at the Department of Commerce. He never had a government job. He was beat out as a government job at the University of Vienna. He didn't get the top post there, the chair, University of Vienna. So he had a Privatdozent post, which is an unpaid teaching post. However, that's pretty prestigious in Europe. It's not very prestigious here. So he was a Privatdozent in Vienna, and he has a regular job as a Department of Commerce in Austria. And he had his private seminar in his office at the Department of Commerce in Vienna, where all these people, all the big shots came, all the brilliant young intellectuals and economists in Europe attended this seminar and more or less converted, at least semi-converted. I just list a few of them. Of course, Hayek, we know, Fritz Machlup, Haber, Lord Robbins, Eric Voegelin, the famous political theorist, Alfred Schutz, future Prime Minister Gaitskell, Labour Party Prime Minister of England. And he wrote a Misesian-type article in the early 30s, I think it was, and perhaps it kept him from going all the way to the socialist doctrine. At any rate, one thing that Mises did, by the way, I think should be pointed out, he did not, as some younger Austrians do now, he did not artificially separate theory from practice. In other words, he did not say if you're an economist and a scholar, you can't have anything to do with politics. It's somehow evil to have any public policy connection. He almost single-handedly, I would say virtually single-handedly, stopped the Austrian inflation in the 1920s from becoming a hyperinflation. He was very concerned, of course, it would go the Austrian krone, I guess it is, would go the way of the German mark. And by constant pressure on the Austrian government, he prevented them, he managed to get a currency reform, and it prevented them from having all-out hyperinflation. In his very sweet, moving notes and recollections, which he wrote while fleeing the Nazis in 1940, his autobiographical note, he said maybe he shouldn't have done it. Maybe it'd been better to have run away inflation. But at any rate, I think it's pretty clear that all of his life, Mises did not fail to pursue the truth in whichever way wherever it led. And he warned, by the way, of the Great Depression. He said there will be a Great Depression when this inflationary boom stops. And doing that, he set himself against the dominant American doctrine, which is Irving Fisher, the pre-Friedmanite, professor at Yale, who claimed everything was going great because the Fed was keeping the price level constant. If the price level is constant, there's no inflationary problem to worry about. And Mises kept saying it's not true because if you have any kind of inflationary bank credit, you will create, price level is not the key thing. The problem is that production is being distorted relative to its free market position, and interest rates are distorted. So, with Mises' prediction turning out to be correct, at least in that sense, people got more interested in Misesian doctrine after the crash in 1929. In the meantime, during the 1920s, it was a very productive decade for Mises. There's, of course, the rise of socialism and Bolshevik revolution in Europe. And Mises shortly after World War I, made a decisive contribution to the whole socialism debate. Now, everybody realized, even socialists, I think, realize, have always realized, there's a big incentive problem under socialism. The incentive problem has often been summed up as, who will take out the garbage in a socialist society? Everybody's equal, everybody is free to labor, everybody gets equal income. Who's going to take out the garbage? Or, who's going to develop Siberia? That's another interesting question. There's Siberia, right? Assuming it needs to be developed. It's off there and, hell and gone somewhere. Who's going to schlep out there and build it up? Okay? So, now the socialists answer this question, well, we will create a new socialist man. The people will be transformed by education, or brainwashing, if you want to put it that way, to want to serve the collective in any way they want to. Okay, any way the collective wants, send me to Siberia. Yes, yes, right? Or make, yes, I love the garbage if it's socialist garbage. So, now, and we know pretty well now that the incentive problem has not been solved, won't be solved. But aside from what Mises did in his great article 1920, is that let's assume that the problem is solved. Let's assume everybody now loves the collective. Everybody's been successfully brainwashed. He doesn't use the term brainwashing, of course. Everybody wants to serve the collective. What are they going to do? How are they going to serve the collective? And Mises' point was, even if you solve the incentive problem, you can't solve the calculation problem. Namely, nobody knows what to do. How many people are sent to Siberia? What should they do there? How many machines, how many mines should they build there? How many people should be assigned to garbage? How many people are road building? Who knows? Without a price system, as Mises points out, without private ownership of the means of production, without, therefore, a real price system and resources, there's no way anybody can figure out what to do and who to do it and what techniques to use or anything. We're all at sea without a rudder. And that was his great point as economic calculation under socialism, Article 1920, which he expanded in a famous book called Socialism, 1922. And socialists began, of course, to try to answer this. In those days, socialists were much more theoretically inclined than they are now. Now I don't think anybody wants to even consider this kind of, at least in the West, I think they do in the East. They're very worried about what to calculate. And so they said, yes, we'll pretend there is a market. There was a famous Longa solution, which I grew up on in Columbia. Longa solved all that because you just pretend there's a market, and you make managers act as if they're profit-making or loss-making entrepreneurs. Which, of course, Mises replied to that. He really replied to that in his first article, as far as I'm concerned, is that you can't really do that because since there's no private property, you can't take entrepreneurial losses. There's no such thing as saying, go pretend that you're making losses or profits. You're not playing Monopoly game. This is the real world out there, and there's a big difference. There's no way in which they can calculate. There's no real price system. And I think, after all, interestingly enough, the communist countries have never installed a Longa system either. They never even tried to do it. The thing which solves the problem in socialist countries is mostly the black market, which is rampant. And in some cases, like in Hungary and Yugoslavia, the black market is more or less taken over. They've legalized it in most senses. So that, in a sense, they've given up. And one of my favorite anecdotes on that, I started teaching at Brooklyn Poly in 1966, 67. I taught comparative economic systems then. They didn't let me teach it after that. At any rate, I taught it one fall. I spent most of the time talking about how great the market is, how lousy government planning is. And finally there was an exchange professor from Hungary, a distinguished economic historian. I said, well, bring him in to decide give the other case, the other side of the point, the other side of the view here. And he came in, and the kids were pretty left-wing. I said, hey, this is great, now we got the other side of the story. And he spent the whole time the whole class talking about how great the market is, how lousy planning is, and saying Hungary hasn't gone far enough yet toward the free market. They were left goggle-eyed, as you can imagine. All right, then I think now it's sort of a standing joke in the economist circles that if there are any kind of world congresses of economists, the communist country economists talk about how great the market is, and the Western economists talk about how great the planning is. And I think Western economists have sort of hived off on that, sloughed off on that to some extent in recent years. So in addition to this, Mises doing all this in the 20s. He's working on his business cycle theory. He's working on his critique of socialism. In addition to that, he comes out with critique of interventionism, showing that government interventionism doesn't work either. Price control doesn't work, creates shortages, taxes cripple saving and investment, protectionism is destructive, and so forth and so on. Then he says, well, interventionism then is cumulative. In other words, when the government intervenes in a problem and tries to solve it, it doesn't solve it, and instead it creates 3 or 4 more problems. Then it's confronted with this choice. Either we repeal the first intervention and give up, or we expand on to try to conquer these other 3 or 4 problems, which of course they always do. This leads to socialism. Then you wind up, socialism can't calculate, you wind up in what you call an impossible situation. So, the result, interventionism is unstable. It either leads back to laissez-faire or the free market or on to socialism. Since socialism can't calculate, you have to wind up with laissez-faire. As Mises' political conclusion. And Mises, of course, all during the 20th century, all during this time of growing statism and collectivism and protectionism and everything else, corporate liberalism, communism, socialism, fascism, all that, Mises stands all of his life as an uncompromising champion of laissez-faire liberalism. And heedless of the fact that the whole zeitgeist is turning against them. It's not heedless, attacking it anyway, continuing on regardless of any opposition. In addition to that, there's other problems for Mises. In addition to statism growing, communism, socialism, statism, protectionism, all that, corporatism, is also growing up unsound methodologies that are undercutting economics. Right? All economic theory. Basically, two twin enemies, so to speak, institutionalism and positivism. Positivism, of course, has become dominant, at least until recent years. Positivist model treating economics like physics. All sciences of human action have to be, in order to be a science, have to be like physics. They have to be tested. They have to be mathematized, etc., etc. Have to be quantitative. They have to predict. And men are therefore treated as stones and atoms and predict their patterns and so forth and so on. So Mises rises up against this and says this is incorrect. There's a fundamental radical difference between stones and atoms on the one hand and people on the other, namely people make choices. People think, they've got consciousness, and they act. They have purposes and goals, and they act to try to achieve them. Atoms don't act. Atoms don't make choices. Atoms don't think, etc. This is a key point, and of course, in setting himself on this path, Mises went against the dominant methodology of social sciences in the 20th century, increasingly dominant. And Mises says that economics is built up, economic theory is built up on the logical implication of people act and make choices. There are people and they have values and make choices. And so he then sets forth this methodology, which he later called Praxiology, in his Grundprobleme der Nationaleconomie, Foundations of Economics, in 1933, and continues to set forth the true relationship between theory and history in his great book, Theory and History, 1957, which I recommend everybody, which is almost unfootnoted even among modern Austrian economists. And pointing out exactly why there can be a theory, it has to be a theory, and that it's not based on mathematical atoms or whatever, it's based on the fact that people act. He termed institutionalism, by the way, which seems to be rising up among some younger Austrians, he termed it anti-economics, and I think it's perfectly accurate. This, of course, goes back to the German historical school doctrines of Gustav Schmoller and the University of Berlin. As if he hadn't accomplished enough, after having set forth the correct methodology of economics, praxiology, he then decides he's going to create a doctrine based on this methodology. Too many methodologists spend their time just talking about methodology, what economics should or shouldn't be doing. He said, okay, I'll do it. I'll create an economic structure based on the correct methodology, and he did it in his great work, National Economy, 1940, which was published in Germany in World War II, during World War II, and therefore was totally forgotten, and then was translated and expanded to Human Action in 1949 in the United States. The original version came out in Europe in 1940. In the meantime, while this is happening, Mises, his leading follower in business cycle theory and capital theory and socialism theory, F.A. Hayek, moves to the London School of Economics in 1931, leaves Vienna, comes to London. And one thing we have to realize about, if you don't know this by this time anyway, is that even though every scholar has passed the language test for a PhD in German and French, nobody really knows a foreign language, let's face it. And nobody reads foreign language. I would say nobody, but very few. And so very few people read the Mises or the other Austrians in German. Menger wasn't translated until after World War II. Von Bauwerk was, luckily, and Mises wasn't until the mid-30s. So they didn't get read in England or the United States. And when Hayek comes to the London School of Economics and starts his lectures, it was a fantastic eye-opener to the English economists, because they were confused. There was a Great Depression that hit. It was 1931. What's the explanation for it? And Hayek comes with the great business cycle theory of Mises, expands on it, and this immediately converts the whole gang. All the people which very famous names in economics, Hicks, Kaldor, Lerner, Beveridge, Sir William Beveridge, all these people became Austrians for about 3 or 4 glorious years. And started writing in the Austrian Hayekian Mises-Hayek tradition. When Keynes comes along, when Keynes' general theory comes along, and by the way, in those days, the United States, economics in the United States was sort of like a farm club of England. Marshall was the big dominant figure. American economics had more or less died out. There were no real theorists much during the whole interwar period. Economics was mostly institutionalists, therefore talking about how lousy the market is, and more or less that's about it. And so there's very little economic thinking going on in the United States. And then so we sort of follow along tail after England. And so when the younger economists in England became Austrians, the American economists began to become Austrian. The leading, well, he didn't understand it very much, but the leading semi-Austrian in the United States was none other than Alvin Hansen for about 4 or 5 glorious years, plus a few others. Theory about how theories get accepted and rejected in economics. There was no patient refutation of Austrianism by the Keynesians. They didn't sit down in the journals and refute them. It's a lot of nonsense. It almost never happens that way anyway. It certainly did not happen with the Keynesians. It just was like a fantastic change of fashion. It's like rock succeeding swing. Okay? That's it. If everybody starts talking about liquidity preference, the consumption function, and with a diagram of the Keynesian cross, and nobody refutes the Austrian theory, just forgot about it. Just like it's down in the Orwellian memory hole. And most of the Hayekians converted to Keynesianism. And Machlop and most of all these, of course, Hicks and all these people, and Lerner in England, etc., of course, all converted. And even Mises' former students converted, at least partially. So although if you look at Machlop and Haber on these people, even when they were Keynesians, they were more moderate than the other people. That's the best you can say for them, I think, in this epoch. And we wound up only with Hayek left after having converted most of bright young English economists. By the end of the 30s, there's only Hayek left as not a Keynesian. And again, Hayek unfortunately he admits now he made a grave tactical error. When Keynes' Treatise on Money came out, which is supposed to be his great masterpiece in 1931, I guess, Hayek refuted it in a magnificent very long devastating two-part journal article in Economica, which really wiped the floor with it. And Keynes then said, okay, it's back to the drawing board. And obviously this thing doesn't work. So he comes back with a general theory in 36, and Hayek thinks to himself, well, I could do the same thing with this thing. It's no better, probably worse than the Treatise on Money. Why waste my time on it? Because Keynes will change his mind in a couple of years anyway. That was, of course, famous last words, and the rest is history. So in economic theory, then, we have a sweep of Keynesianism, washing out even memory of Austrian business cycle theory, much less, I say, not refuting it, simply wiping out the memory of it. And then Mises flees from the Nazis in 1940, and really sort of like a movie thing, where he's one step ahead of the Nazis, coming to France, and he escapes from I forget what's Spain and Portugal, comes to New York in World War II. Well, his life in ruins, and he writes his marvelously moving notes and recollections in that period, and he writes in despair of the end of civilization. And he also he says there, I think, as I remember it, that Menger withdrew from economics, and Bombardier, he claims, committed suicide because of the World War I, because of the onset of World War I, the wreckage of the great civilization. So he comes here penniless, in his 60s by this time, writing in a new language, in a world where he couldn't get an academic post. Neither could Hayek in the United States either. Now here we have a situation where every Marxist and semi-Marxist refugee coming from Europe is immediately hailed. The red carpet is rolled out, gets top positions in academic posts in the United States. And Mises he's being supported by the William Volcker Fund at that time, which is a small, unknown, but glorious little conservative libertarian institution, now defunct for various obscure reasons. And they're trying to get him a university post. The only thing they can get him is NYU Graduate School Business Administration, a non-paid post. In other words, the salary would have to come from outside forces, namely the fee, and I guess the Volcker Fund, later fee, and other consortium of businessmen. The same thing happened in Chicago. And with Hayek, they were able to get him a post at the University of Chicago, slightly higher in the academic rank than NYU School of Business. However, again, they wouldn't pay Hayek. First of all, the economics department of Chicago rejected him. And he got a post in a new department in Chicago called Committee on Social Thought. Is that still in existence? Okay, good. And so interdisciplinary Committee on Social Thought. But his salary was paid for by William Volcker Fund again, and then by consortium. Neither Mises nor Hayek ever got any paid post in the United States, which is, absolute disgrace. I can't conceive anything more monstrous, blot in academia than this, right? The so-called devotion to academic freedom and all the rest of the garbage. When it gets right down to it, this is what happened. Okay, so in this situation, Mises never complained. I had the joy of being in his seminar for about 10 years in NYU. Never complained, always very cheerful. He was surrounded by students who were a bunch of clucks, let's put it frankly. Most of them. They were mostly there because they knew he was an easy A. He didn't understand anything about American grading system. What's A, what's B, okay? They said, give us A. I think a professor, that sort of thing. So it's, and except for the fact that there were some people who had read about Mises and sort of were drawn to him. And one of the conditions of his getting a post there was that it would be open to being audited by other people like myself, other, young Misesians coming in, and sure it was. So that was the saving grace of it. He never complained. He was always tossing out research projects for people, which almost never were taken up, And it was just a great experience listening to him. I could see why he was a great teacher as well as a great economist. He was just trying always to stimulate productivity in anybody around him. And one of the great comments, I think marvelous comment that he made, that we should like to make, students were, of course, very shy. He's a great professor, and he's a young klux here, what we know. So when he would have an hour lecture and then he'd have open a question, nobody would want to say anything. And he said, look, don't be afraid to speak up, he said, because whatever you say, whatever it is, however idiotic it is, some eminent economist has already said it. And of course, it was true. So this, and so he managed to recreate the atmosphere of the Mises Christ, the famous circle of great young economists in the 1920s in Vienna. And in Human Action, he comes out with Human Action in 1949, his great crowning achievement. Well, I was up at Phi. He was up at Phi at the time. I was up at Phi, and I asked, well, they said Mises is coming out with a book. I didn't know Mises at the time. They said he's coming out with a new book. This is 449. I said, what's it about? They said everything. And sure enough, that's what it was. I just want to tell a couple of great stories. He was a great source of anecdotes about war. It's like living in pre-World War I Vienna, which must have been magnificent, marvelous, except for the lack of air conditioning. It must have been perfect. And he talked about these. He tells these great anecdotes. For example, he told an anecdote of, just to tell you two of them. One is this, when the Bolshevik government of Bela Kun took over in Hungary in 1919 for 6 short, unglorious months. I think it was about 6 months. Karl Polanyi, the famous economic historian, later to get a big post at Columbia, I might add, paid post. Karl Polanyi was the Bela Kun government's negotiator for a trade agreement with Austria, and Mises was the negotiator for Austria. And they walk along Vienna. He said, of course, both of us knew that the government's not going to last more than a couple of months. So Polanyi wanted to stay in Vienna. He didn't want to go back to Budapest. The horror in Budapest. They just sort of, they walk around the streets of Vienna and talk about what's life in general, whatever. And it was very pleasant. Sure enough, they waited out the fall of the Bela Kun government, and Polanyi's hide was saved. Another charming story, I think more even opposite to Mises' general doctrine, is he's walking along the streets of Vienna. I do a lot of walking. Even I walk in Vienna, which is, I hardly walk anywhere. It's a marvelous city to walk in. And walking along the streets of Vienna with his friend Max Scheler, who's a big shot German idealist economist. And Scheler, denouncing logical positivism, which then, of course, is big in Vienna, started in Vienna. And Scheler says, Tell me, Lou, what is there in the climate of Vienna? What is there in this place that breeds these logical positivists? What's there in the climate? And Mises took a shrug. He says, look, after all, Max, Vienna is a city of about 3 million people, I guess, something like that, 3 million people. And there's less than 12 logical positivists, so it can't be the climate. So in this situation where the trend of the times was against them politically, methodologically, economically, he never gave up. Constantly great fighting spirit, and doing it all with a great sense of charm and even sweetness. Never made any personal attack, as I know of, against anybody. And continued on with this marvelous, tremendous productivity virtually until he died at the age of 92 in 1973. In 1974, the year after he died, Hayek got the Nobel Prize in economics. It was a fantastic thunderclap in the economics profession. Who's this guy who got the Nobel Prize? Who is he? And in order to find out who he was, some of them had to go back and read something, and that seemed to have sparked an Austrian Renaissance in the economics profession. And he got it, by the way, not for his later work, Hayek, but specifically for his Misesian business cycle capital theory of the 1920s and early 30s and mid-30s. And since then, there's been an Austrian revival, and it's unfortunate Mises didn't live to see it. Well, yes, I guess that's really all I have to say. I think it's a marvelous comment. He's a person who was just a marvelous person in every way, both as an achiever in economics and general thought in general, and as a person, as an exemplar for anybody following after him. I think there's still a tremendous outpouring of affection for Mises among all ranks of life in the United States, even this time. It's just marvelous. Thank you.